Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Michael Fisher, founder and director of the Fearology Institute. I'm doing my third video right now, and will be the last in the series on understanding Jordan Peterson. It's been quite an interesting trip for me. This week, particularly, studying how Jordan Peterson understands fear is one thing that I want to cover in today's video. I also want to let you know I'm going to be looking also at how other people perceive what Jordan Peterson is doing, how he's teaching, and how it perhaps, as some people have accused, seems to be perhaps fear-mongering itself. And so I'll deal with both of those kinds of angles in this video. As, again, an introduction, it's so hard to cover someone with such diverse range that he has on the topic of fear, for example. And the previous video was covering his range of views on conflict. And the first video on his just general, my critique of his social theory and compared to his psychological clinical theory. I'll put links for both of those other two videos below. I'd highly recommend looking at them before this video, but again, not essential. I'm just going to jump in and wing this video again with some ideas just touching surfaces. Fear is my favorite topic, if you haven't gathered that already, and obviously. The Fearology Institute was one of my recent ventures to focus on. I think we're in a world where we need a highly specialized and highly generalized universal theories and practices in better understanding fear and its management and transformation. So that tells you a little bit where I'm coming from. And if I had to summarize very quickly, fearlessness is my philosophy. And if I looked at Jordan Peterson overall, courageousness is my philosophy for Jordan Peterson. And that is actually a significant difference that will come out in this video. Courageousness, fearlessness, how are those related? And fear being in the core between understanding those responses, right? Fear responses, not just flight, fight, freeze as a fear response, but actually courageousness as a response. And what might fearlessness be, which is what I'm promoting. And I will argue, try to make a bit of a case that Jordan Peterson hasn't quite got on that path of understanding the fearlessness tradition and the fearlessness movement. I personally would like his movement, the phenomenon that he has been spearheading and that even goes before him, which seems to be a great search for meaning for many people, especially we've been talking about young males in these video series, and Peterson often talks about that. And this goes back to Joseph Campbell's work. Jordan Peterson's been compared to Joseph Campbell, who appeared in the 60s, 70s with a quite powerful cultural influence. And into the 80s, even in 90s, Joseph Campbell, a mythologist, bringing together new stories for the hero. And I believe Jordan Peterson is within that same genre of why he is invoking this powerful phenomenon of interest and very passionate inspiration to many, of course, and many critics, because the notion of the hero myth and the hero's journey and notions of what is courageousness, when is that violent, when is that healthy, all these issues become very important in the postmodern critique of that kind of modernist heroic narrative, and even a narrative that goes back into pre-modernity in the West and even in the Far East. So Peterson's touching on some real tender nerves, as I've said before, and I'm going to, in this video, focus on how fear is conceptualized and so important, and is Jordan Peterson actually promoting the courageousness, his philosophy, and promoting that. If you remember Rule 1 in his book, The 12 Lessons for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, really first rule was stand up tall, hold your head up high, and that is basically his be courageous, the courage to be, the kind of existentialism. Before I dive into one of the first really interesting quotes from Jordan Peterson on fear and anxiety from one of his lectures, I just want to show that my work particularly has a depth in foundations of existential analysis to include psychoanalysis, and ultimately where I'm kind of demonstrating today for my students particularly, which is what this video is focused for, and if others are interested in the video, great, is to demonstrate what fear analysis would look like, at least at a very beginning level. So I'm doing a fear analysis of Jordan Peterson's work and the phenomenon behind it. Let me just start now with that quote, because I think from this lecture, when I heard Jordan Peterson speak this out, he says, I'm a clinical psychologist. I've got clients who come to me all the time, and I meet with other psychologists and so on. And there's a question, he says, that often occurs. So here's Jordan Peterson. Why are people anxious? And I think that is a completely ridiculous question. The reasons for anxiety are starkly self-evident. What I wonder is, why aren't people, a lot more often, terrified out of their skulls so badly every second of their life they couldn't even move? And you laugh. The audience laughed when he said that, because you understand that. It's like anxiety. That's no mystery. It's like brief spells of calm. That's a mystery. End of quote. Again, a lot of laughter from the audience, and I smiled myself in that notion of brief spells of calm. That's a mystery. Right there, we get a real core in that kind of quote of Jordan Peterson's view of the existential problem of life, suffering, our mortality that we face. And it really comes down to the fear of death, which he's really talking about, fear of pain to death, our fragility as humans. And he's devising these 12 lessons for life, all his teaching, I see, with this existentialist depth and a clinical perspective, is how to help people manage that fear better, that deep fear. And he will often use the word terror. As he said, I wonder why it is that we aren't more terrified out of our skulls so badly that every second of life they can't even move. End of quote. That's where he gets interested in his notion of courageousness as a philosophy for life. So in many ways, I find all of his work fundamentally could be boiled down to how can human beings be courageous and do the right thing and not be run and controlled by fear. Well, my philosophy, as you can see, fearlessness, is similar to that and includes that notion of courageousness, but I think transcends and goes beyond what courageousness is, and I'll get to that. So what else does Jordan Peterson say about fear? I think interesting in his books, 1999 book, Maps of Meaning, his exploration with a really good evolutionary theory involved in it, is both a psychological analysis and a cultural analysis and how fear relates to them. So at the psychological individual level, he looks at and centralizes, he says it pretty clearly several times, fear is the central primary motivator of the human condition, of organisms moving out into the world, into the unknown, because we have to learn so much coming out of the womb, and we're constantly in the unknown. And he connects that with fear. So fear is central, and I like that. I think that's a really unique and interesting way to think about human motivation. And then he says, and then, we'll learn certain adaptive strategies to encounter those unknowns, all the things that we have to learn. And hopefully we'll learn, as he says, some positive lessons and positive things, and we'll get some pleasure and reward that'll make us want to go out there and investigate that again. And then there's also things that were very threatening sometimes, perhaps even near-death experiences that pull us back to be more cautious, more fearful. So kind of he uses a scale or a spectrum of more fearful parts of ourself, always at the core. He always says we're working from that basis because we always are moving out into the unknown potentially and potential threats. And yet there's a hope of the gains and victories and just the joy of growing and changing, which is also necessary for human development, right? The process of becoming, as he speaks about often. But there's a fragility of being itself. So that's foundational to his existential philosophy. And with that is that core, kind of a surrounding atmosphere of fear. So by this time, as I've just given you a pretty good summary, I think, of his general philosophy of why fear is so central and important to come to be aware of, which he says, we need to really become aware of that fragility of being, that terrifyingness. And then he says, but why aren't we terrified all the time, right? In that little lecture you just gave, that quote. And he says, because we develop personal virtues, character strengths, courageousness or bravery. And the second part, he says, is because we're part of a social being and a cultural organism, and we're surrounded and embedded in both family and cultural matrices of support, and not only that, of even symbolic relations that give us a sense of immortality beyond that fear of mortality that the individual has in that risky world that they have to live in, and you have to live in as an individual. But you have this cultural buffer, this cultural support system. And that's why he's so interested in religion, myth, ritual, in maps of meaning, and it seeps into his other work. And why the hero, which is always culturally defined, heroes grow out of the culture and are meant to be images that we can carry. Example, Christ would be one example. Images we can carry of these humans who have these wonderful characteristics and qualities and virtues, but at the same time had a great connection to the best and moral, ethical strengths and victories of cultural evolution. And in a way that is an evolution of our species itself, going through a trying and difficult cosmos of environmental conditions and dangers and threats, and life is precarious, and then ultimately die. So that's where he plays with meaning, and he believes that those meaning structures that culture provides, as well again as the individual with their developmental learned strategies, adaptive strengths to handle the unknown and unpredictable and predators and threats, and that growing intelligence, which is a kind of defense intelligence, as I call it, in my idea, that all of those are combining to build this, in Jordan Peterson's sense, I guess, the most alive, creative, meaningful existence that one can live. And why he's so concerned about, let's say, postmodernity and the challenge to modern cultural values and traditions, which is very typical of the postmodern critique. And remember, the modern critique, and I've called him more a modernist, it's also had its critique of pre-modern traditions and values, and was very challenging to those traditions. Well, and of course, all of those traditions will fight and defend and say, hey, you folks, you want to go off and do this new postmodern thing, or post-postmodern, or whatever the venture is, that's cool that you're all excited and exuberant to do those things, but Be aware of traditional core universal things that have been learned by the culture and heroic figures within those cultures to remind us of the virtues, the character qualities that have reproducible and survival value and deep, rich, meaningful value, and that also kept the collective together. And so any tradition is always concerned about too much newness, too much change, too much critique coming at tradition. And we see that. That's, to me, the foundation of the phenomenon that I see going on right now is Jordan Peterson is offering this philosophy of courageousness, which is a way to handle and manage fear. And that's why fear is so central in his work, because there's a lot of fear. That's my specialty of analysis for the last 30 years, is the growing culture of fear, this society of fear that is both existential, natural, we could argue, ontological, and that is also culturally constructed and manipulated through forces of domination, pathological hierarchies of domination, conflict and violence and traumatization, growing culture of fear. Well, Jordan Peterson knows that. He knows that this has been a great excess of fear that's traumatizing and terrorizing, from that cultural, political, again, media, all kinds of big elite powers that control systems and can make people very afraid and use that fear against people. Institutions can do that. It's the downside. And that's where the cultural fabric that's supposedly supporting this great heroic individual in Jordan Peterson's mind and what he calls in cultural history gets attacked, and we end up celebrating anti-heroes and almost celebrating victims in postmodern culture, a critique often labeled at the postmodern politics of identity and the crisis of legitimation in the postmodern condition. And so again, talking mostly about the so-called developed world, really facing this postmodern crises of authority, legitimation, what is the best way to go, who's going to guide us. And Peterson sees a lot of that so in question in the postmodern critique. Not that he's against critiquing traditions, because he's not. He thinks we need to, but he says don't tear everything and rip up everything apart just because you want to go off and explore, some kind of identity. He says respect culture. That's courageous, he would say. Looking like you're fearless and attacking all foundations, all traditions in critique, because they're not perfect, and they do have problems. So this well-educated criticism from postmodernity, which he also is sometimes called the neo-Marxist disguise of ideology, he thinks is tearing the fabric apart of those social foundations, and too much. So, how much is too much, how much is too little, that's hard to determine. But Jordan Peterson has his own compass, his moral compass, and he's sort of basically saying it's creating too much fear. All those changes, all those new ideological critiques and critiques of all kinds of on tradition, he thinks are causing too much fear. And I think there's something to that. We are definitely in a society moving toward more and more fear. Yeah, I like this book here from the 80s of, James Hillman and Michael Ventura, two psychoanalysts, James Hillman, psychoanalyst, archetypal psychoanalyst, and Michael Ventura, I think, was a journalist. But they had a great discussion on, we've had 100 years of psychotherapy, and the world's still getting worse. And I would just add the world's getting more fearful. And there's something failing in our typical psychotherapy and our social systems. And what we have to learn is some kind of new therapy, some kind of new guidance system for social and moral order to keep that fear operating in its positive side of controlling too much violence potential, or people going off and doing, just whatever they want, selfishness. And Jordan Peterson will talk a lot about that. He's not in favor of that kind of just full-fledged open, everybody do what you want. And he often criticizes the left for representing that position. And the question really then comes around to, if there's too much fear being generated and we sort of don't seem to have the social systems, political systems, the psychotherapeutic systems over these, let's just say, last couple hundred years of attempting to build a better society, and one that's sustainable, sane, healthy, in touch with the planet and its ecosystems. The argument is because we're so afraid and we're so self-survival based, and then we're also in this cultural, traditional preservation dynamics that's going on. So a lot of fear all over, and it's causing a lot of conflict. And you'll see continually in Jordan Peterson's work, he links conflict with fear and fear with conflict, and it causes the individual versus the society and how to negotiate that. So what then comes around, and this is where I want to go next a little bit, is that the critics sort of show up, and it's something I ask in a fear analysis immediately. So fear analysis for me is I'll look at anybody's text, their discourses, their work. And when I did with Jordan Peterson in the last few weeks, I just zoom in and say, okay, what's he saying about fear? What's he say about terror? What's he say about courageousness as a response to fear? Does he use the word fearlessness, which I don't see he does? He will use courage and bravery and the heroic, common associated traits of the hero. But there comes a point where then I have to ask the question, well, if he's putting forth this social moral theory and way to conduct life as individuals and as a collective, the good society really is what he's putting out, is he really helping us manage fear better, right? Like, is he improving on what has not been done so well? And is he intervening in sort of mediating this cycle of fear / conflict, violence as the potential, and trauma that goes with that, which just breeds more fear in the system, more anxiety, more terror of people really not reaching their potential and getting beyond this fear-based, victim-based living. He's very interested in all that. And so, but the question comes is he using fear in his teaching, theorizing, to try to build a society that manages fear better? So even though he says fear is like natural, and that's a very problematic statement and claim in my work of the fearlessness movement, fearlessness philosophy, because fear can't be isolated from the culture of fear phenomenon and that traumatization that's been accumulative for hundreds of years, as that book on psychotherapy was saying, where we really don't seem to know how to slow it down. And that's, quote, scary in some sense. But is he fear-mongering? It really comes down to it. So I'm just going to read a few things I saw in different critiques from articles and websites. And this one person said, because Jordan sets up such an enemy base in his social theory of, the West, where the West, he sort of uses that term in a very loose way as being kind of the modern advanced society, which he thinks is one of the best societies ever. He's kind of referring to North America and I guess Europe and so on. Problematic, but he does. And then he sort of says, there's this anti-Western, postmodern, neo-Marxist ideology from the left and so on that's trying to destroy the Western values and the progress of that culture. Remember that cultural formation that has learned all these adaptive strategies and strengths for both individual emotional support and for cultural character and support and stability. Anyway, this one critic says this framing of this conflict of ideas in this binary of West versus anti-Western in terms of is a type of geographical chauvinism, and creating the external threat, just period, is inaccurate in terms of what the real reality is, and it's scaremongering. That was one of the criticisms Petersons. Some articles then complain, and these are articles more supportive of Peterson's view. Fear-mongering has always been the preferred tactic of populists, but it's no antidote for chaos. It's what feeds the chaos. So that is still kind of a negative view. But as I was saying, there's actually some websites that are critiquing other people for fear-mongering around Peter Jordanson and his work, right? So the question is, who's doing the fear-mongering, right? Is it Peterson and his fans, the movement, that phenomenon of trying to build a better, less fear-based society, more courageous as a vision, social vision? And is it also perhaps the critics of that movement of fear management improvement are actually fear-mongering and saying, oh no, don't go that way with Peterson and those folks, because that's going to cause more fear and violence, and it's abusive and oppressive to all kinds of peoples and so on. So there's fear-mongering being used there as a tactic of attacking, and then Peterson will also use the fear-mongering on the attackers. So in a fear analysis, where do we go with that? Is an interesting question. And I think we're left with, well, we have to go somewhere other than fear and courage, and throwing around the term fear-mongering. You're fear-mongering. Well, you're fear-mongering, and where is that going to go, right? If we don't have, that's not going to go very far, because we need, I agree with, we need to challenge whether fear-mongering is going on when somebody offers so-called better solution. Are they using fear to win their argument, to win people to follow them, to win votes, to win money, support, and political positioning, and creating the kind of curriculum that those movements want to create? We have to challenge. So it seems to be part of the process to do this calling back and forth about fear-mongering. And because I said fear is a big topic, because everybody's sort of feeling this culture of fear building, more or less. And there's so many people writing about it and thinking about it and critiquing whether, it's necessary or not. And so this vying for what's going on in the world of fear, the fears world, I say is a kind of fear wars. So Jordan Peterson and others would acknowledge, other critical social thinkers, that there is a culture wars going on today, and I agree, and that's really intense. The classic example is kind of traditional values and postmodern values and clash and so on. Sometimes around Republican, Democrat, if you're in the States, and so on, liberal, conservative. There's a culture wars very deep in that goes beyond politics, and it goes to this notion of cultural stability and the fear and terror underneath in the vulnerable existential condition of the human being. It's a very tense situation of who's protecting who and protecting what, because fear is underneath. That's really my point. But where do we go? This looks courageous, this throwing, you're a fearmonger. This looks courageous. You're the fearmonger. We're not going your way. We're going to be more courageous. We're going to stand up tall and put our heads up, and rule one of Peterson's, and be that new citizen, that better ethical character in society. And yet off very conflicted, because I think nobody has really and is offering much of a theory of fearlessness. It's implicated, a theory of fearlessness or philosophy of fearlessness, sort of implicated in that we're not happy when too much fear, right? Excess is motivating movements and phenomenon. And we're not happy when it feels like we're using fear, or somebody's using fear tactics to try to manage fear better. And if those are fear-based tactics, and totalitarianism would be one, fascism would be another strategy, or just someone in a family system or a friendship system using bullying and as a fear-based tactic to get power and force, directions of privilege and strength, domination. So without a theory of fearlessness, I feel like, and I can't go into that in depth in this video. I'm only going to touch on it, but you can certainly read my work of many years. I've been publishing all kinds of work, and other people have on fearlessness as a new possibility. So I'm really putting it out in this video as something that Jordan Peterson doesn't talk about, and that he also, because he doesn't talk about fearlessness, in my view, he's operating on a fear management system and approach that's not quite at the integral holistic level, and therefore embraces a very deep understanding of fear itself. So he has some notion, and he's guiding us. He's guiding everybody he talks to, really examine fear and how it's working in your life, how it's such a part of the fragility of being, and yet at the same time you don't have to be a victim to that. You can actually have hope and courage and all those good heroic characteristics, and help lead your culture into innovation and creativity and good things, love. But the courage discourse, which he uses, this bravery, courage, Western heroic discourse, and he relies on people like Ernest Becker, great book by Ernest Becker, and I saw that Peterson was citing this in his book Maps of Meaning, and understanding how important culture is a type of fear management system. And that's what Becker's argument is, and has been actually proven in various literature, experimental work. It's like social psychology. Peterson's aware of some of that for sure. But social psychology and psychology of being and change is not enough. We have to understand social cultural systems and how they're protecting themselves, trying to manage fear. So Jordan Peterson promotes, as I said, that discourse like Ernest Becker, but they do not talk about fearlessness as a path. They don't seem to see that opening as, again, my philosophy does. And I draw on a lot of the Eastern philosophies in North, South, East, West, across time. And I've written a book on the fearlessness tradition, which you can find around my name on the internet and so on. Fearlessness is the biggest change with that, from bravery to courage to fearlessness, being very brief here, is fearlessness asks us and demands us to be a connoisseur of fear, to use a term from Sam Keen and my colleague friend Four Arrows, where fear has to be studied in more than, okay, yeah, I know the feeling of fear and I know flight, fight, freeze. No, that's basic to understanding at the courageous level of fear management system. But beyond that, we have to jump quite a gap to get up to fearlessness, and that really demands us to study and know fear. And that's why I'm starting this whole field of domain of thinking called fearology and fear analysis. And these are just barely beginning to be, in the last only a couple decades of human history, really being intensely systematized and classifying more intensely the human experience in relationship to fear. And fear is so central, which it is in Jordan Peterson's work, which I'm glad, that's because he's, to me, very existentialist. But even the existentialists never built that systematization, nor does Peterson, of how to promote and encourage a greater study of fear. So you won't see that in his 12 Rules for Life, his very famous popular book right now. You won't see that. And in fact, my research has shown that in the West, the type of thinking that Jordan Peterson represents, from Western Enlightenment and philosophy and theories and social theories and psychology as well, just this whole Western paradigm, if you want to put it in one big package, I've argued in a few papers that I've written that the West seems to be afraid of fearlessness, because it doesn't want to really talk about it a lot. You know, it throws out the word fearless and fearlessness, but they're always just sort of, you know, explicatives and hyperbolic kind of expressions beyond courage, right? Like be fearless and so on. And that person's practicing, you know, just fearlessness. But there's nothing underneath it, you know, there's no substance, there's no theoretical, philosophical underpinning, and really wisdom. But that's the direction I would encourage as you study Jordan Peterson on fear. And I think he is fear-mongering, unfortunately. First video, I said he's kind of fear-mongering around Marx and Marxism thought, which is really also socialism and what he'd call the grand failures of communism, socialism, Marxism. So he is kind of fear-mongering around that as I watch, and I think it comes down to he really, in some sense, is afraid himself of the chaos of the world. Well, some level you could say, well, who isn't afraid of the chaos of the world? Who isn't afraid of the chaos of the breaking down of the social order? Well, that's gone on for most of human history, and people have developed social theories, functionalism, for example, which I mentioned in one of the other videos at the beginning on Peterson. It's kind of a anti-revolutionary theory, social theory, and I think Jordan Peterson really sits in that. He's kind of afraid of revolutions and revolutionaries for some really deep historical reasons, is my guess. So again, I'm just doing a little bit of a quick superficial fear analysis, not saying this is the way it is, and not saying I've done an extensive analysis, and I'm not, you know, trying to tear Jordan Peterson apart based on what his fears might be. That would be really insensitive of me to do that, and I wouldn't want it done to me. But I want to engage the conversation around the nature and role of fear, right? In a systematic fear analysis that has a fearlessness perspective, not just a bravery and courage perspective of modernity, but really a kind of postmodern, post-postmodern fearlessness context or paradigm. Again, can't go into all that in this video. You can watch some of my other videos, but there's an interesting question, I think, related to this that came up on, it was one of the websites that, you know, where you can throw in a question and certain experts will come and try to answer it. And it's called QUOR, Quora. So this was posted in 2018 by somebody, and people responded. So the question was, I thought, pretty interesting, especially related to the topic of fear. And does Jordan Peterson have any irrational fears? Irrational meaning, you know, not sort of natural, quote, normal, perhaps, right? Trying to say irrational, so pathological fears. So it's like, instead of Peterson, the clinician, always getting to ask, do they have irrational fears, that person or this person? Somebody turns back the gaze from using this question, which is one of an interesting inquiry, I think, from a fear analysis point of view, and returns the gaze back to the clinician. Well, do you have any irrational fears? So Of course, Jordan Peterson hasn't answered that question, but other people were throwing in their 2 cents, and basically some said, yes, he does. And some would say some of the similar things that I've said. Seems to have a bit of an irrational fear, perhaps, around chaos, social revolution, Marxism, and anything that is not in his worldview as status quo enough and as cultural respectful enough. Jordan Peterson really gets triggered quick, I find, and I see what I'd call a fear-based tendency when he thinks somebody's attacking the cultural fabric that he so respects and has studied, and rightfully so, as did Carl Jung and the people and Becker, who Jordan Peterson quite loves, Jung especially, that, yeah, they have a great respect for those cultural traditions as being fear management systems. And that's what I'm saying earlier in this video. And so somebody who's attacking the fear management system of a culture, of a society, of, quote, the civilized world, you could link all those if you wanted, which I think Peterson inevitably has to look at that. He does link those. That if fear is sort of motivating a lot of his defense, and one has to ask, is that a healthy fear? And it may be in part. And when does it start to reach to the irrational fears? That's why this question interested me. Does Jordan Peterson have any irrational fears? And the way I would put it is differently in a fear analysis is, when does Jordan Peterson's fear as a healthy defense intelligence, essential to all organisms and systems, living systems, when does it start to shift into a more fear-based, so kind of a more than 50% fear-based motivation, and creating an affective situation of affect and passion that often will move into a type of violence because it is fear-based itself. And that's not the best healthy way for systems to operate. So again, that's a larger theory of how I would justify that, and would take a lot of time in a teaching video to do. That's not my intention here, but to maybe think about, and as I conclude here, that fear wars might be a useful way to think about what's going on in the phenomenon of which attraction to Jordan Peterson and then attraction to other kinds of leaders, good and not so good leaders, we're seeing in the world today, with great implications as to what these leaders can do, of all kinds, all stripes, political stripes, but the tendencies of moving to fear-based leadership, right? A type of fear-mongering that's so a part of their authoritarian complex, to dominate and control and to get people on their side and to keep people in boxes and control. So moral social order through fear-based manipulation. Well, remember, if you look at Jordan Peterson's views on child rearing, and I read some from quotes from the last video on conflict, and if I was to had time, I would go into his views on children and fear, and he does, come down very clear to say, no, you need to discipline and punish children when necessary, as parents, as authority, as school teachers, etc. And then he adds, as I saw one quote this morning, and be cautious, be careful. So he knows that the use of fear to manipulate and to control and to use as power, you're touching on a fear that's very deep in all of us, and that those strings can be pulled and stretched and exacerbated and damaged and hurt and traumatized, because we are very essentially, and I like Peterson's view on this, is we're essentially motivationally and affectively, the feeling level, affectively and motivationally. That's our primary source, he says, for meaning and the purpose that drives us to want to live, create, be good. And if that gets messed up, so the rational is okay, that top part of our rational brain, but it's that emotional, affective, motivational brain, much deeper, that he will talk about and say that's really our core. And that's where he puts fear. And he says fear is right at the core of that motivational, affective strategy. So I'm saying the same thing when I say, you know, we have to examine really through careful analysis, become much more sophisticated in our critical literacy on fear and fearlessness, as I've suggested in this philosophy of fearlessness, this extension where I think social theory needs to go, and psychological theories, where Jordan Peterson and his movement, I think, could benefit from. And, you know, let's get together and lead a strong movement that is emancipatory, is actually healthier, and is overcoming, you know, the unnecessary fear-based patterns of design and operations and structures and institutions and our own behavioral motivations. And so that's the kind of world vision that I carry, and I look forward to engaging with all kinds of people on how we can better move in those directions. And I'll conclude this series with a thank you to Jordan Peterson and all his supportive people, more or less, whoever they are in all their different ways, in my view, are all interested in how to better handle conflict and how to better manage fear and transform that core of our affective motivational core in a world that is really contested and is scaring the hell out of pretty much everybody, more or less. And we don't have to be complete victims to it. So I agree with Peterson on that. It's just a matter of how we get there. And him and I have some different directions in that, but there's complementary aspects too. So thanks very much for this today, and look forward to chatting more in the future.